Welcome, folks, and let me spin you a tale of heartache, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds of family that will have you shedding tears of joy by the end. Enjoy the story. The bitter wind whipped Sarah Jenkins's stringy blonde hair across her face as she trudged down the cracked city sidewalk. 3 weeks out of prison, and the world was still rejecting her at every turn. She pulled the tattered remains of her coat tighter, but it did little to block the bone-chilling gusts. A discarded newspaper tumbled past, its headline emblazoned, "Family Slaughtered in Home Invasion," a stark reminder of the depravity that seemed to lurk around every corner. What was the point of even trying to get her life together? The hole she'd dug for herself was too deep. The climb back to any semblance of normalcy too steep. Growing up, Sarah had never known the comfort of stability or a loving home. Her mother, Nina, was a raging, vicious alcoholic who staggered through a ceaseless parade of abusive fathers. Sarah's real dad abandoned them before she was even born, the latest in a long line of men to run from responsibility. Deep welts and yellowing bruises were Sarah's earliest memories, her tiny body whipped by the harsh fists of whatever low-life skid Nina had shacked up with that week. But the physical cruelty was nothing compared to the barrage of venom that rained down daily. "You worthless, ungrateful piece of trash!" Nina would scream, the rancid stench of cheap booze and stale cigarette smoke overwhelming. Her hateful eyes boring into Sarah's soul like a drill. "Why did I ever keep you? You should have been aborted!" There were no grandparents or kind aunts and uncles to shield Sarah from the hellish existence. She accepted at a depressingly young age that she would never know the embrace of family or experience unconditional love. A bone-deep loneliness settled into her very being. Sarah was just 17 when she met Paul Thompson at the greasy diner where she bussed tables after school. With his warm green eyes, mop of sandy hair, and easy smile, he was the first person to ever make Sarah feel anything resembling special. "God, you're beautiful," Paul had murmured one night as they sat in his beat-up old Chevy truck after Sarah's shift. His thumb gently caressed her cheek. "I've never seen anyone as gorgeous as you." Sarah blushed furiously, certain he must be joking. But Paul's sincerity and affection were unmistakable. For perhaps the first time in her tumultuous existence, she allowed herself to dream of what life could look like beyond the daily hell of her childhood home. Over the next 6 months, she fell deliriously, hopelessly in love. Paul showered her with compliments and kindness, slowly chipping away at the towering walls of insecurity she'd built up over the years. "You're so smart, SJ," he crooned as they snuggled on his sagging couch. "You've got a good heart, and you're strong as hell to have survived your mom. You could make something of yourself, be somebody." The young couple clung to each other with a desperate passion, both seeking refuge from their troubled pasts. When Paul asked Sarah to move in with him, she leapt at the chance without hesitation. But their happiness didn't last. One evening, less than a month after Sarah moved into Paul's cramped apartment, a drunken Nina showed up unannounced, screeching curses and slurs from the hallway. "This is the kind of filth you are, girl!" Nina bellowed as she barged through the door, shoving Paul backwards. "You'll never be nothing but a worthless trash whore, just like your mama." The vile words sliced through Sarah like knives as Nina's spittle flew across the room. Sarah watched in abject horror and humiliation as Paul's expression morphed from shock to revulsion. I can't do this," he choked out, unable to even look at Sarah. "I thought you were different, but you're just like her." Sarah stood by helplessly as the first man she'd ever loved stormed from the apartment. Within hours, all her belongings had been unceremoniously deposited onto the sidewalk. With nowhere else to go, Sarah slinked back to the squalor she had so recently escaped. Less than a year after her traumatic split from Paul, Sarah's life plunged to unprecedented depths. Her mother's newest boyfriend, a vile and abusive man named Roy, took his twisted fixation to a terrifying new level. One night, as Sarah was showering in the ramshackle apartment's fetid bathroom, Roy barged through the splintered door, ripping open the mildewed curtain with a savage yank. "I've had enough of you teasing and prancing around, showing off for me," he growled in a gravelly whisper, leering at Sarah's naked form with undisguised lust. Sarah froze in shock and fear as his paw-like hands eagerly reached for her. But her stunned paralysis was rapidly overtaken by a raging survival instinct as a lifetime of pent-up trauma bubbled to the surface. Letting loose an animalistic shriek, Sarah lashed out furiously with the first weapon she could find, an old shaving razor lying in the sink. She slashed upwards viciously, over and over, as Roy howled in agony. She felt a twisted sense of satisfaction watching his blood splatter across the cracked tiles. But in the aftermath, as an ashen-faced Nina screamed at them both from the shadows, the law swiftly descended. Despite Sarah's desperate plea that she was defending herself from a sexual assault, the court saw it differently. Just a few months past her 18th birthday, she was tried as an adult and sentenced to 6 years in prison for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Scared, alone, and still coming to grips with the horror of her home life, Sarah went into labor while imprisoned and gave birth to a baby boy. But as quickly as she experienced that rush of maternal love, strangers in scrubs were whisking the newborn away. "Take him, honey," one said, not unkindly. "Give him his best chance at a good life." Weeping uncontrollably, Sarah cradled her son for only a few precious minutes before she was forced to let him go, perhaps forever. Watching him be carried off to become someone else's family was the most excruciatingly painful experience of Sarah's wretched existence. Released from prison 3.5 years early for good behavior, Sarah was deposited back onto the same unforgiving city streets that had birthed her. Doors, opportunities, hope itself seemed to be closed off for a 24-year-old ex-con struggling just to survive. She needed steady work, that much was certain. But what kind of legitimate employer would ever take a chance on someone with her rap sheet and history of violence? Sarah shuddered at the thought of inevitably returning to the streets, selling her body, or getting roped into illicit activities just to put food in her belly. She'd sacrificed her dignity once out of desperation. Could she really bring herself to do so again? As she rounded a corner, Sarah suddenly heard a distant muffled cry somewhere beneath her feet. An open manhole cover gaped before her like the mouth of an abyss. Peering inside, she made out the form of a young boy, no older than 6 or 7, curled up at the bottom and wailing in obvious fear and pain. With no hesitation, Sarah sprang down into the dank darkness. "I've got you, little one," she murmured, in as soothing a tone as she could manage through her panic. "Just stay still and I'll get you out of here." She gently scooped the mud-caked child into her arms and passed him up to the sidewalk before hoisting herself out as well. "Easy now," she said, rocking him slightly. "Let's get you back home." Perhaps, she thought with a sliver of hope, this impulsive act of kindness would finally convince someone of her true character beneath the surface, that she deserved a second chance far away from the world that had mercilessly chewed her up and spat her back out. Sarah approached the modest home in a quiet suburb, taking in the freshly mown lawns and cheerfully painted houses that stood in stark contrast to the dingy, decaying tenements of her childhood neighborhood. At the front door, Sarah did a double-take, her breath catching in her throat. A large portrait hung on the wall, and on the portrait was she, Sarah. The woman took a few steps forward. It was her, and it wasn't her. Sarah had never had such long hair, and neither had her clothes. Even before prison she had preferred pants, and here a light dress, in florals. "Grandma! Grandpa! I'm home!" the muddy boy called out in a tiny voice. Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest as an elderly couple emerged from a nearby room to greet them. The woman's eyes went wide as saucers when she caught sight of Sarah, her mouth dropping open in shock. "Oh, my lord! Nina! Nina, is that you?" she gasped, raising a trembling hand to her lips. Sarah slowly shook her head, studying the bewildered old woman. No, I'm not Nina, but I think you knew my mother." The elderly man beside her squinted at Sarah quizzically before understanding seemed to dawn across his weathered face. "Well, I'll be," he murmured in a gravelly southern twang, "if you ain't the spittin' image of your mama when she was younger." Sarah felt her throat constricting as the woman stared at her with tears welling up in her eyes. A torrent of long-suppressed emotions threatened to burst forth. "You look so much like her," the old woman continued, hands now clasped over her heart. "Oh, Sarah, we searched for you for so many years after your mother disappeared. We never stopped." The elderly couple introduced themselves as Emily and Richard Baker from Monroe, Louisiana. Sarah learned that they were indeed her maternal grandparents, the family she had been certain was lost to her forever. As Richard guided them to the living room with a hand on Sarah's elbow, Emily continued to study every inch of Sarah's face through a sheen of grateful tears. "I can't believe this. I never thought this day would come," she said in a trembling southern lilt. "Finding you after all this time. It's a miracle straight from the Lord." With shaking hands, Emily reached out and cupped Sarah's cheek in a touch so tender it nearly broke her. "Last time I saw you, you were just a little bundle. 3 years old, maybe? Before your mama ran off with that evil boyfriend." Emily's voice caught in her throat, forcing Richard to take over the heartbreaking story. She just up and left one day. No word, no call, no nothing. We went plumb out of our minds with worry for years after. We hired private detectives, missing persons investigators, you name it," Emily interjected gruffly, swiping away tears. "But we never could find a single trace. It was like Nina and that bastard had just disappeared into thin air." The old man placed his gnarled hand atop his wife's and continued solemnly. "Years went by and, well, we feared the worst had happened, that she met some terrible end out there." Sarah stared at them in stunned silence. Her grandparents, her flesh and blood, they had been searching desperately for her and Nina the whole time. She felt like her entire reality had been upended in the course of an hour. A tiny voice piped up from behind her. "Who's this lady, Grandma?" Sarah turned to see the young boy she'd rescued peering at her curiously. Emily smiled through her tears and beckoned him closer. "Why, this is Sarah," she replied, wrapping a bony arm around his small shoulders. She's your mama, little Max. Your mama that we've been looking for since before you were born." The unfamiliar word hit Sarah like a freight train. Mama. Her mind instinctively flashed back to those fleeting moments in the prison nursery, holding her son for the first and only time. The son who was now standing before her, all grown up without her. Over the next several hours, Emily and Richard filled Sarah in on every missing piece from her fractured origins. How they had only learned of Sarah's existence and subsequent imprisonment from a private eye years after Nina's death. How, upon being paroled, Sarah's newborn son had been put up for adoption before Emily and Richard were able to take him in as their own. As darkness fell outside, a contented lull settled over the cozy living room. Sarah watched with a surge of feelings she couldn't quite place as Max curled up beside his doting grandparents on the plush sofa, his small eyes growing heavy. He looked content, loved. "We ain't got no illusions about making up for the past, honey," Richard said at last, his baritone voice subdued. "We can't restore what was stolen from you and that boy." He draped an arm around Max's tiny frame, looking at Sarah with a combination of sadness and hope. "But, well, we'd be awful glad if you stayed here with us for a while. Gotta know your son." His voice cracked with emotion. "Gotta know your family." Fresh tears sprang to Sarah's eyes as the unfamiliar word family washed over her like a soothing balm. For 24 torturous years, she had resigned herself to a solitary life of struggle, defined by her traumatic past. And now, through what felt like divine intervention itself, she was being presented with a future, with people who loved her. With trembling hands, Sarah leaned over and gently pulled the bemused but smiling Max close, breathing in his warmth and innocence. A kaleidoscope of memories flashed through her mind, holding him as a newborn, feeling that profound love, being forced to let him go into an uncertain world. Fate had somehow, impossibly, brought them full circle. A chance encounter, a random act of kindness, and now, Sarah was home. As she gazed into Max's eyes, she realized she finally had the opportunity to be the mother she never had, to break the vicious cycle once and for all, to shield him from the hell she had endured. Sarah looked up at the smiling faces of her grandparents, feeling a sense of peace and purpose unlike anything she'd ever known, and nodded slowly. The fractured road had been long and brutal before leading her here, but as Sarah enveloped Max in a tearful embrace, she realized her true journey was only just beginning. At last, she had a family.